wind from the ancient Montana forest howled in bursts, slipping through the gaps in the old wooden roof and slashing across the fog-covered porch of the cabin tucked deep in the valley. That house looked out onto an empty yard with nothing but a few clumps of withered flowers and a white fence mottled with black mold. It was where Mrs. Helen had lived for nearly 20 years since her husband passed away. Almost no one ever came by. That morning, the cold was so bitter that frost crystallized on every door handle. When Helen opened the door, the air cut straight into her face. She was about to step down to gather the chopped wood from the day before when, suddenly, her eyes froze. In the middle of the snowy yard, beside the old oak tree that had lost a limb to lightning last year, there was a shape, something that wasn't a rock nor a pile of trash blown in from the factory at the foot of the hill. It was a shivering mass, covered in snow and tinged with blood, lying motionless on the white ground. Helen stopped. Her heart pounded, whether from the cold or from a rising sense of foreboding like a faint knock echoing from the past. Step by careful step, she moved closer. The nearer she got, the heavier the air became. Her breath turned into thin vapor, dissolving into the silent stillness of the snowy woods. And then she saw clearly a small, frail creature, its spotted fur matted, its short tail curled tightly to its body. One of its back legs was twisted, bruised. Dried blood clung to its mouth. A bobcat kitten, much too young and far too alone. Normally, wild animals stay away from human homes, but this one, it had crawled all the way to her doorstep on the very night temperatures had dropped to -20 degrees. No one knew why. No one tried to find out, but the way it lay there, curled up and bracing against the bone-deep cold, it was as if it knew. Only here might it have a chance to survive. One of its ears was torn, scabbed with blood, and its eyes, barely open, lids a pale purple like someone on the edge of death. No one, not even Helen herself, could explain why her legs moved forward instead of back, why her old hands trembled as they removed the wool scarf from her neck and wrapped it around the frail, frozen body that no longer even flinched. She only knew that in one brief, silent moment, she saw herself, lying alone in the snow like that, the year the only man she'd ever loved died. Perhaps loneliness has a language of its own. Perhaps this wild creature had heard it. When Helen carried it into the house, no one saw. Only the old doorbell camera captured the image of her opening the door, bending down, then lifting up a limp form, a blurry scene in the early mist. But later, that footage would be replayed hundreds of times, because just 3 weeks later, that very Bobcat the abandoned creature, would do something no one could have imagined. It would save the old woman's life from an accident that nearly claimed it. But for now, everything was still. Only snow, wind, and a small life lay motionless in her hands. Helen's wooden cabin sat nestled among ancient pine trees, where the forest sloped down toward the northern valley of the Bitterroot Range, Montana. In winter, the place felt cut off from the rest of the world, only the sound of howling wind, snow nearly 2 feet deep covering every trace, and a suffocating silence. People called it seclusion, but in truth, it was more like being forgotten, when no one remembers you and you stop expecting anything. Helen once had another life, a youth filled with laughter, a husband who worked in forestry, and camping trips full of memories. But all that ended one winter, 17 years ago. A logging accident killed him instantly. Since then, she stayed in the home they had built together. In the early years, she still wrote letters to old friends and kept a retriever named Max. But then friends stopped replying. Max died of old age, and only she remained, alone with the quiet. And then that morning came. The night before, a light snowstorm had swept through the woods. It didn't fall in thick layers like the early January blizzards, but enough to cover every old trace. That morning, when Helen stepped onto the porch, the chopped wood from the day before was blanketed white, as if it had never existed. She pulled on a heavier coat, added a dark brown knit hat, and carefully stepped down the icy stairs. Every morning, she followed a routine, walking a loop around the house, checking the chimney, scanning for animal tracks in the snow, then venturing into the woods behind for fallen pine branches. It was what made her feel she still belonged to the living world, a small, consistent act, like brushing one's teeth to feel human. But today, before she'd taken 5 steps, something unusual caught her eye. Just under the brush near the eastern oak, where she used to leave a water tray for deer in dry season, there was a patch of snow, grayish-brown, completely different from the pristine white around it. That patch wasn't still. It moved slightly, as if something was breathing. Helen froze. It wasn't the first time she had seen wild animals here. Wolves, foxes, deer, even the occasional moose had passed by. But never before had she seen a creature lying almost motionless in her yard. Not running, not reacting, just lying there, breathing. She looked closely. A small body, not much bigger than a house cat, but with a short bushy tail and tufted ears. An unmistakable trait, bobcat, but it was too small, too thin. Its fur is patchy, soaking wet, and its belly is stained with blood. One back leg curled in, unmoving. Helen slowly moved forward, each step crunching the snow. The creature didn't stir, didn't flee. When she knelt, she saw clearly. Its eyes were shut, occasionally flickering open, just enough to reveal a pale amber glow. There were bite marks on its mouth, likely from its own kind or a nocturnal predator. No mother, no large tracks nearby, no scent of a group. This bobcat had been abandoned, or chased away, or both. Helen stood there for a long time. Her hand gripped the wool scarf around her neck. Part of her whispered, "This is wildlife. Don't interfere. Let nature take its course." But another part, a faint scratching in her chest, echoed an old memory of another snowy night 17 years ago when she held the cold, lifeless body of the man she had loved her whole life. When nothing and no one remained, only a broken breath and the sense that every beautiful thing had left her. No one had saved her from that pain. But she could still save this creature, even if just a flicker of hope. No words were spoken, no plan was formed, only instinct. The scarf came off, wrapped around the freezing bobcat. She lifted it from the deep snow. The small body was limp, offering no resistance. But the warmth, it was still there. That heart still beat. She brought it inside, placed it near the fireplace, layered with thick towels. Her hands trembling, she fetched some cotton and saline from the medicine cabinet, supplies she once used when Max got injured. Carefully, she cleaned the blood on its belly, discovered old claw wounds scabbed over and a torn ear still bleeding. When she reached the back leg, she saw the joint was dislocated. She dared not adjust it, just gently secured it with a cloth and a small wooden splint. The bobcat didn't meow, didn't whimper, only breathed slowly, steadily, almost lifeless, yet clinging to something, the will to survive. 2 hours later, she mixed warm, diluted milk, the formula she had learned decades ago. Raising an abandoned kitten, with a small spoon, she dripped it at the edge of its mouth. The bobcat didn't react, but by the third drop, its tongue stirred, then swallowed. Helen nearly cried. Not out of joy, but because of hope, a feeling she thought she could no longer feel. That night, she slept in the armchair by the fire. Every time she opened her eyes, she looked toward the bundled creature lying still by the embers. The tiny head moved slightly with each breath. Ears drooped, and the whole room was silent. Nothing existed but a fire and two forgotten beings, trying to warm each other with the life they had left. She didn't know its name, nor whether it would make it through the night. But she knew deep down it hadn't come here by accident. It had chosen the right person. And from that moment, the fates of these two lonely souls, one human, one wild, became bound as if by destiny's mark. The next morning, pale sunlight streamed through the frost-covered window pane. In the cabin, the fire had burned low through the night, leaving glowing embers that shimmered in the frozen stillness of dawn. Helen stirred in the chair, her neck stiff from sleeping upright, her back aching where the wool blanket had slipped to the floor, who knows when. She blinked, then immediately sat upright. The corner of the room, where the wine-colored scarf had been wrapped around that small body, was now empty. The bobcat was gone. For a moment, her heart skipped a beat. All her thoughts collapsed into one. It had left, and she didn't blame it. Wild animals, no matter how small, were born of the mountains, never to be held back by the warmth of a fireplace or a few drops of milk. But then, behind the armchair, a small movement, a soft breath. Helen turned. The bobcat kitten was lying by the wall, legs tucked in, eyes half open, golden, deep, dreamy like a sliver of moon. It didn't run, didn't growl or search for an escape. It had simply moved to where the draft was weakest. Survival instinct, though faint, was still guiding it to the safest spot it could find. To Helen, that wasn't just intelligence. It was a kind of choice. It had chosen to stay. She crept closer, crouched, and once again checked the back leg. The bandage was intact, but the tissue around the joint had begun to swell. She wasn't a vet, but she had cared for many animals and knew how to tend basic wounds. However, this wasn't a house cat, and what she was about to do might earn her claws, blood, or worse. But the bobcat stayed still. As she began unwrapping the first layer of bandage, its body only flinched slightly but didn't resist. No growling, no biting. Its eyes remained open, watching her every move. And in that gaze, Helen felt something catch in her throat. Not fear, not pain, but trust. Over the next 3 days, Helen's life veered in a direction she had never imagined, especially not at 63. Every morning she woke up earlier. The thermometer continued to show alarming numbers. -17, -21, then -18 again. But none of that mattered more than checking whether the bobcat had opened its eyes, had taken a little more milk, or whether its body temperature was holding steady. She learned to boil water and let it cool to exactly 37 degrees Celsius, warm enough to clean its body without causing shock. She changed its bandages, gently massaged the swollen leg, and applied her homemade herbal oil to reduce inflammation. At first, the creature was nothing more than a tangled ball of fur, frail, silent, almost non-existent. But by the 4th day, a miracle occurred. It stood, just for a few seconds, Its legs still trembled. Its body was still tilted. But it stood. Helen didn't cheer, didn't clap, didn't break the sacred stillness of the moment. Only warm tears welled in her eyes. Because she knew from that moment on, this creature had chosen life, not by instinct, but by will. As the bobcat's strength slowly returned, other thoughts quietly slipped into Helen's mind. Was she doing the right thing? In Montana, keeping a wild animal without a permit was illegal. Bobcats were a protected species, often hunted for their fur, but captivity, even with good intentions, was strictly forbidden. She knew that. She also knew that if discovered, the bobcat could be taken away, or worse, euthanized for safety reasons. But she knew something else too. If she hadn't taken it in that morning, it would have become just another frozen carcass beneath the snow. And that death would have meant nothing. Not survival, not natural selection. Just because no one saw, but she had seen, and she couldn't look away. On the 5th day, strong winds rose. The old house creaked with each gust slamming against the roof. Helen sealed all the windows tight, tucked extra blankets into the wall crevices. The bobcat lay on a small bed she had fashioned from old sweaters and cotton towels. It no longer shivered. Its eyes were more alert. Its ears perked at every snap of wind against the trees. Late that afternoon, while brewing tea, she heard a faint sound, a scratching noise. Not from the door, but behind her, from the wall facing the woods. She walked over and pressed her ear against the wood. Nothing, but the bobcat, still lying motionless, suddenly opened its eyes wide, staring at that wall. Its ears stood high, back arched, body tense like a drawn string. It heard something. Something was out there. That night, sleep came hard. Her heart was uneasy, as if lined with thorns. The next morning, as she stepped outside to take out the trash, she froze. In the snow, clearly, very clearly, was a trail of footprints. Larger, heavier, walking from the forest to her back doorstep, then returning the same way. Not the kitten's prints, not those of a nocturnal scavenger. These were the prints of an adult bobcat. Helen stood still, not cold, not afraid. Just one piercing thought driving deep into her heart. The bobcat hadn't come alone. Someone or something had left it here. That day, for the first time, she locked every door, drew every curtain, and sat silently by the fireplace beside the sleeping creature. She didn't know whether the forest was watching her through the fogged windows. Didn't know whether wild instinct would return to reclaim what belonged to it. But she knew one thing. This kitten no longer belonged to the place it came from. It belonged here. At that moment, the only place where life still flickered was under the roof of an old, solitary woman. Someone who had once believed she'd never again be capable of saving anything. From that morning on, after discovering the adult bobcat's tracks in the snow, Helen never stepped into the yard without checking the window first. She became more cautious, not out of fear, but from something she couldn't quite name. As if between her and the shadowy forest, a thread had formed, thin as spider silk, yet taut with meaning. The bobcat couldn't speak, but whenever she looked at it, Helen felt something strange, as if it were hiding a secret that words could never convey. The little wooden house no longer felt as silent as before. First came the soft footsteps, claws gently tapping the floor, then the rustle of a wool rug being dragged as the bobcat practiced walking, then the creaking of a wooden chair each time Helen stood to fetch milk, a towel, or simply to check whether it had fallen asleep. Every day, Helen prepared warm milk, carefully added egg yolk, pureed chicken, and steamed vegetables. Meals not found in a wild animal's diet, but suitable for the fragile creature slowly recovering in her care. The bobcat ate little, but regularly. The way it chewed and swallowed, deliberate, controlled, made her more convinced it was different. Not the kind of animal that tore at food by sheer instinct, but something more contemplative. She never gave it a name, never taught it tricks, never trained it to trust humans. She simply lived with it like two beings, colliding by chance in a vast, frozen world, learning together how to keep going. Week 3. The bobcat could now stand firmly on all 4 legs. The wound on its back leg was healing, still limping, but no longer swollen. Its coat had begun to shine, each strand catching the evening light. Eyes bright, cheekbones defined, ears tufted and alert at every noise, signs of a creature returning to its wild nature. And just as it regained its strength, Helen began to feel empty. Before, each morning she woke with one purpose: to keep it alive. Now, as it roamed the house, leapt onto chairs, stretched to peer out the window, she had no more reason to hold it back. Deep down, she knew the forest was calling. But the problem was, it didn't leave. Even when the door was ajar, even when the forest wind swept through, even when the large prints reappeared each night on the porch, the bobcat stayed. It chose to remain, though it never rubbed against her legs, never made a friendly sound. Every night it still lay by the stove, not in the scarf anymore, but curled on the old rug where Max, the retriever, once slept. One night, Helen awoke in the middle of the night, stirred by the faintest sensation brushing her palm. The bobcat, whether awake or dreaming, had gently placed its front paw on her hand. No scratch, no grip, just a touch. And then, as if fate wished to test the boundary between the two lives, it happened on a winter afternoon. Helen was washing dishes when she heard a soft thud on the porch. A strange noise, not a falling branch or shifting snow. She pulled the curtain back and froze. A large wild cat, not a house cat, not a wolf, stood at the edge of the yard. Upright ears, spotted coat, short tail, broad shoulders, powerful hind legs. It didn't move, but its gaze was unmistakable. An adult bobcat, its head tilted slightly as if studying. Then slowly, it stepped toward the wooden steps. Helen stood behind the curtain, heart racing. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't call anyone, couldn't startle it. She turned her head. The bobcat kitten had seen it too. It stood near the door, eyes wide, ears down. No hiss, no retreat, but no approach either. Then, in a fleeting instant, their eyes met through the fogged glass, like two stars from the same constellation, silent, cold, and deeply knowing. The larger bobcat didn't roar, didn't strike, just watched for a few seconds, then turned away, vanished into the forest as if it had never existed. Helen stood still. She didn't know what she had just witnessed. Was it a mother and child, a leader seeking a lost member, or a predator? She only knew that from that night on, the bobcat kitten often lay by the window staring into the woods for a long time before falling asleep. The following week, Helen began testing the back door. One morning, she shoveled snow from the yard, left the door unlocked. When she returned, the bobcat was gone. Her heart clenched. But as she stepped onto the porch, she saw it sitting still on the wooden step in the snow. Not running, just sitting, quiet. When she approached, she turned to look at her. A long look. Then walked back inside. From then on, every day it ventured out for a few hours, circling the yard, sometimes disappearing into the forest's edge, but always returning before sunset. One day, it brought back a small pine branch from somewhere in the woods, placed it by the fireplace. Not to eat, just placed it there. Helen didn't know if it was marking territory or offering a gift. The old house was no longer lonely, not because of noise, but because of its presence, silent, yet vibrant, as if the breath of the wilderness had entered through every crevice and stayed, along with those golden eyes. Helen no longer felt like the one who had saved the bobcat. She felt it was the one who had pulled her out of the long, relentless winter of old age. Simply by existing, simply by staying. That winter night arrived as gently as a blanket of mist, but hidden within it was something unusual. The wind didn't howl as usual. The moon was full like a polished mirror, shining so brightly that the shadows of pine trees etched sharply into the snow outside the porch, dark and clear as ink on silk paper. Helen sat knitting near the fireplace. The bobcat lay just a few steps away, curled on the faded fur rug. The firelight flickered in its eyes, making the amber glow look like a quiet ember still burning. The only sounds in the room were the occasional crackle of firewood and the soft clinking of knitting needles. Steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. There was something in the air that made her uneasy, a silence too perfect. The kind of silence that only those who've lived long with nature recognize as the sign of impending change. Since the afternoon, the kitchen stove had been acting up. When she lit the flame to boil water, Helen had heard a faint hiss from the old gas pipe, something that hadn't been inspected in years. She made a mental note to call a repairman after the snowstorm, but as usual, she postponed it. Little did she know that very delay would become the line between life and loss. Midnight. The moon hung at its peak. Helen woke to a faint sound, not quite a crash, more like a strange wave of heat spreading from the kitchen. The air was stifling. Her eyes burned. She staggered to her feet, took a few steps, then was struck by dizziness. Her left leg buckled, her knee slammed into the wooden floor, her head hit the edge of the table. The world tilted, her ears rang. No one was there. No one. The house groaned in long creaks from heat and pressure. On the floor, Helen lay motionless, her breath weakening. And in that moment, the extraordinary happened. From the corner of the room, the bobcat leapt up. It didn't bark, didn't screech. It ran, first to her side. It sniffed, lightly pawed at her hand. No response. It lifted its head, ears alert. In a split second, it looked toward the front door, now gathering smoke. It ran there, jumped, scratched. The door wouldn't budge. It turned back, scratched at her, pulled. Not enough strength. It bit the edge of the scarf she was wrapped in, tugged, tugged again. Teeth clenched around the wool. It stepped back, again. That small body dragged a figure 5 times its size, inch by inch, out of the gas-filled room. Each yank, each backward step left skid marks on the wooden floor, and sweat dripped from Helen's unconscious brow. Just as her foot crossed the threshold, a sharp boom burst from the kitchen. Part of the house went up in flames. Smoke billowed high. The bobcat scratched at the door, ran in circles. No one in the forest, no one nearby. But it didn't flee. it returned to her side, scratched again, dug its claw into her shoulder, not deep, just enough to trigger a reflex. She coughed faintly. The next morning, a neighbor, an old man who lived 3 miles away, came after seeing smoke the night before. He found Helen lying on the porch, wrapped in an old rug, her head resting on a coat, her body warmed by the early sunlight. And what stunned him was the bobcat, standing a few feet away. Not afraid, not fleeing, watching him cautiously, then turning to disappear into the woods. Later, when reviewing footage from the old front door camera, it was clear the bobcat had dragged her out of the doorway, had placed her in a safe spot, and just before the fire exploded, it had turned back, as if to make sure she was out of danger. But that wasn't the part that sent chills down spines. Because at the end of the footage, as the thin bobcat stood silently in the snow, another shadow appeared behind the trees. A larger bobcat, with thicker fur and piercing golden eyes, stood at a distance, watching everything, then vanished. Helen survived. Only a few bruises, no serious injuries. But after that day, the bobcat never returned. It disappeared. No tracks, no goodbye. Only a faint scratch on her arm, a mark of survival, and a searing memory in her chest of a wild creature once teetering on the edge of death, who became her savior. She didn't tell anyone the story. She only wrote in her journal, "I once thought I saved it, but in the end, it was the one who saved me, in a way no one would believe." After the gas explosion, Helen was taken to the town hospital over 30 miles away, across forests and snow. She didn't say much. Her wrinkled face, her trembling chin, and her eyes fixed on a distant place that no longer belonged to this world. The doctor asked how she escaped the house while unconscious. She only smiled faintly. "Someone pulled me out," she answered. People offered explanations, a seizure that threw her toward the door, or some unconscious movement. But no one could explain the long drag marks on the floor, or the coat carefully wrapped around her, something she hadn't used in months. And that final clip, where a thin bobcat stood in the red-lit snow, a silent witness to something miraculous. When Helen was discharged and returned to the charred remains of her house, everything had changed. Half the cabin had collapsed, the roof slanted, walls scorched. Ash and snow mixed like salt over an open wound. But strangely, she didn't cry. She simply walked slowly across the old porch, touched the door frame, then looked out toward the forest. No one needed to tell her the bobcat wouldn't return. It had done the last thing it came to do. Days passed, a week, 2. Helen lived in the small shed behind the house, once her husband's workshop. No one had stayed there since he died. But now, it has become the only intact shelter. Each morning, she still opened the door, brewed tea, placed a bowl of warm milk on the step, and waited. Not in hope, not in despair, just waiting, as a quiet habit. On the 3rd week, one early morning, with dew still clinging to the wooden frame in silver drops, she opened the door as usual and froze. In the thin layer of snow, footprints, small, paired, evenly spaced, not deep, clearly not a heavy animal, but steady, deliberate, leading directly to the step where the milk bowl now sat empty. She said nothing, only knelt down, laid a hand on the print, as if touching a still warm memory. The next day, again, and on the 3rd day, she saw it. Not in the yard, but at the edge of the woods, where the tallest pines cast shadows before the sun could rise. The bobcat, now grown. Thick coat, distinct markings, wide shoulders, strong legs, but its back legs still limped, a sign that couldn't be mistaken. It stood there, not coming closer, not running away, and beside it, another bobcat, larger, darker, with a long scar behind its left ear. No way to tell if it was a companion, a mother, or a guardian of the wild it once belonged to. Both of them looked toward her. Wind swept through the valley. The treetops whispered in a language only nature understood. She didn't speak, didn't approach, just stood, waiting for a gesture. And then the bobcat took one step forward. Only one. Not near, not close enough to touch, but just enough for their eyes to meet one last time. That gaze was no longer that of an abandoned animal. No longer a look of pleading, of helplessness, but the gaze of a being who had lived, who was grateful, and who had chosen to forgive humanity. The next day, they were gone. No more footprints, no more empty bowl of milk, no more shadows at the edge of the forest. Only Helen, standing quietly in the snow-covered yard, holding the faded wool scarf, eyes lifted toward the place where the forest still held its unnamed miracles. Years later, townsfolk would tell their children the story of Helen, the woman who miraculously survived a gas explosion, saved by a wild bobcat. No one could prove anything. No one had solid evidence, but Helen, whenever asked, would only smile, gently stroke the faint scar on her wrist, a relic of that fateful night. Her life gradually returned to its rhythm, but no longer wrapped in the silent loneliness of before. In her heart, there was always a small space, quiet but warm, where the memory of a tiny wild creature had left an unerasable print. Whenever she looked out at the forest, she no longer felt emptiness, because she knew, somewhere out there in the hushed mist, a pair of golden eyes still watched over, no longer needing to appear, just existing. That was enough. And she no longer saw herself as the one who saved a lost animal. She knew, without doubt, that it was that simple act of kindness that had saved them both. There are things we do not do for a reason, not for reward, not because someone's watching, but simply because they're right, simply because the heart cannot turn away. And sometimes that one act, small, silent, without recognition, becomes the flame that warms a dying life, or a soul long asleep within its own existence. If you've ever experienced a moment of being touched by life, through the gaze of a pet, a wild animal, or just a gentle nudge from the natural world, share that story. Don't keep it to yourself. Because someone out there, lost in despair, might find hope through your words.